I'm with Robert MENAGH, former HR manager for the City of Cornwall, Ontario. Mr. MENAGH, there's been a lot of coverage about you in the media. Do you think you've been fairly portrayed by the media?
Well, I can answer that question this way. In terms of what I'll call the professional media members out there, the editorial writers, from what I've been told and what I've read myself, I find their approach to the issues that surround me to be getting a little tiresome. I would not be telling the truth if I said that I didn't think it was unfair. I believe that the approach they've taken is very unfair, it's hurtful, and finally it's frustrating. But I have to draw a distinction between the professional members of the media and the ordinary taxpayers out there who write letters to the editor and blog on websites and things like that. I can understand their frustration. I share their frustration as a taxpayer with what's happened here. I mean, I own a home here, I've invested in the community. I share their frustration with what seems to be, to them, an extraordinary amount of money being paid out to me for reasons they cannot understand. So their frustration is born largely of their ignorance of the reasons. And I share that frustration because, ironically, I'm largely ignorant as to what the reasons are as well.
Now, you spent about 13 years working for the City of Hamilton in the same position?
That's correct.
And you spent about 7 years in Cornwall?
That's correct.
Do you think you're a good HR manager?
I'm very proud of the work that I did for the City of Hamilton, and I'm very proud of the work that I did for the City of Cornwall. That's one thing that sort of keeps me going, is what I consider to be the legacy I've left here in the City of Cornwall. Over 7 years, I'm proud of the fact that I've left the human resource management function of the City of Cornwall in much better shape than it was when I found it. And I'm proud of the fact that through a number of initiatives that I took, the taxpayers of the City of Cornwall will either save money directly or avoid costs that otherwise would have accrued to them had I not done some things that I did.
Now, a lot of people say that the reason you were let go without cause was because of issues with the Diane Shea case, some of the other cases at City Hall, but in the Diane Shea case, you were the only person that the prosecutor, the Crown, pulled out of the case and dropped the charges on.
That's correct.
Wouldn't that be a little unusual for you to have those charges dropped and be vilified at the same time? I mean, there have been some comments made even from City Hall that certainly they're not positive towards you, yet at the same time, no one has condemned you for doing any wrong, even at that level. That has to be bewildering to you.
A little. I can't speak to the reasons why the Crown decided to drop those charges. I was not involved in, obviously, that decision. I was not consulted in any way, shape, or form with respect to the decisions that were made in that case. Those decisions as to how to proceed or not proceed were a function, as I understand it, of discussions between the other two litigants, the City and the Crown.
Your direct, I believe, manager, the person you were responsible for, was Mr. Fitzpatrick, the CAO, if I'm correct.
Yes, I directly report the CAO.
Has Mr. Fitzpatrick ever given you a letter of warning or a caution? Have you ever refused orders from Mr. Fitzpatrick during the 7 years that you worked for him?
I've never refused an order, no.
So it would be fair to typify your performance for the City of Cornwall as basically following the direction of your immediate supervisor?
That's what any employee is required to do, unless they want to run the risk of being insubordinate.
Now, to make the decision to terminate you without cause, as was done, it would have been the role of counsel to support Mr. Fitzpatrick's decisions. Were you ever given the opportunity, I don't even know if you're allowed to comment on this, were you ever given the opportunity to speak before council and defend yourself?
No, I was not.
So you were just blindsided with this, essentially?
Pretty much.
Yeah. Now that has to be hard on anybody. I mean, as an HR manager, I'm sure you've had to deal with many situations with other employees, not in your situation, but I mean in different situations. This isn't a customary practice, is it?
I can say that my practice and my experience in investigating matters is to speak to everybody involved in order to get a full picture of what transpired or did not transpire.
Mayor Kilger made a statement about the city wanting to go in a new direction with HR. Are there many directions that a city could go in human resource management?
I have absolutely no idea what that turn of a phrase used by the mayor in this context means at all.
During your 7 years with the city of Cornwall, how many complaints were filed against you personally by city staff?
Well, I should qualify my answer by saying that the city, in its settlement with me, required me to sign a confidentiality agreement, which forbids me from speaking about any matters that are confidential, that arose during the course of my employment. I can only speak about things that are a matter of the public record or in the public domain at this point in time. Okay, so having said that, and I don't want to give people the impression that I've got anything to hide, because I certainly don't. But to be perfectly honest, I don't recall any formal complaint being made against me by any employee, other than being named, as a matter of course, as a respondent in the Champagne-Pilon human rights case, which has achieved some level of notoriety in the local press.
Now, you at your age need to find employment again. And it's got to be difficult when you have this kind of black mark. I mean, being fired without cause, the city going to the lengths of spending as much as it does. Employers have to ask questions, and you're in a very, very specialized field. I mean, the city right now still hasn't replaced you. They've just engaged a consultant at $21,000 to try and find another replacement. There aren't very many people with your background and law degree available in this sort of position. How does that work for someone like yourself looking for a replacement job and most likely having to move from Cornwall? And how does it work for a city of Cornwall to even replace someone of your caliber?
I'll answer your last question first. With respect to the city of Cornwall, at the time I was hired, the city had gone without a manager of human resources for just over a year because they could not recruit. So I was contacted by an executive search firm, and it was a happy circumstance at the time where the city of Cornwall needed me and I needed the city of Cornwall. So it was good. It was a nice synergy that arose there. So the city of Cornwall right now is back in the same position. They might have some difficulty recruiting. I mean, it's been almost 6 months right now. I know that it has some challenges in terms of recruiting senior level people. As far as myself on a going forward basis is concerned, unfortunately in this day and age, applicants for employment have to contend with the internet. Mm-hmm. And part of the due diligence practice now of any executive search firm is to do an internet search of a person's name. And they simply Google my name, and what comes up are all kinds of unfortunate entries. So I have an uphill struggle, and I have to hope that somebody is savvy enough to read what they find on the internet and take it with a grain of salt and read between the lines and just give me the opportunity to place those little snippets that you find on the internet in proper context.
Right, like for instance the another media outlet made a whole big fuss about $293,000, but it's common practice from my research that anyone in a high-level executive position that's not let go for cause is given 2, 3, 5, sometimes even more years settlement. It's not that unusual to get a 2-year settlement when you're let go without cause or for wrongful dismissal.
In Ontario, at the moment, 24 months of pay in lieu of notice is pretty close to the max that anyone would get, regardless of their position, absent a contractual provision that was specifically agreed to the contrary. That number is derived from the application of a formula that was long ago established by the Ontario Court of Appeal in a case called Bardall versus Globe and Mail, where you look at a number of factors to determine how much notice or pay in lieu of notice a departing employee should obtain. In my case, that number was arrived at through a negotiation where there was a give and take on both sides. And
that was when you were hired,
That
correct?
was when I was hired.
Yeah.
And it was, from my standpoint, based on a formula that the city of Hamilton had used back in the late 90s when they were downsizing its workforce in the months and years leading up to amalgamation.
I read a report where the author was stating that nobody on city council knew about your history with the city of Hamilton. Is that even possible?
No.
Because it doesn't make sense. I mean, for people to make hiring decisions based on large salary, high managerial positions and termination decisions for the same situation, surely you have to look at all the facts and data before you start writing very large checks. You would think.
You would think.
So switching gears, what attracted you and what have you enjoyed the most about living in Cornwall?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm happy to answer that. Because when I came to Cornwall, I had never been here in my life. I didn't know anyone. I'd never really spent any time in Eastern Ontario. So I arrived cold, literally and figuratively, because I started right in the dead of winter. And I'll have to admit that, you know, that did give me some pause in early days, but I've said to anybody who's asked me, like, what about Cornwall? And I tell them, the place has really grown on me, and I really enjoy living here.
You play hockey here, right?
Amongst other things, yeah. I've met a lot of people through hockey and through golf. I never lived in a small city before, and I've really come to appreciate the advantages, the benefits of living in a small city such as Cornwall. I think Cornwall is a great place to live. I've thoroughly enjoyed it here and expected to make it my home. So I'll be sad to leave.
And you're a big music fan, and we were talking about Liftoff before. You're going to be going to see which bands this year?
Well, I love Liftoff. I think it's one of the great things that happens in Cornwall, and I've always been keenly interested in the programming there because I'm a music fan, and I'm really looking forward to going to see Sloan and Big Wreck. I had recommended those acts to Chris Savard back in the days when he was involved with the production, and I'm glad they're growing that, and I think it's another great Cornwall thing.
Do you think that the current management of the city of Cornwall can find anybody of your caliber to replace you as human relations manager, resource manager?
Well, I'm not sure how I can answer that question objectively. I can tell you that there is no one out there in the field of municipal human resource management that has my amount of experience and has my educational and professional background. No one can match my resume in the province of Ontario. That doesn't mean there aren't other people out there in the private sector or in the broader public sector. I wouldn't be aware of them. I can only speak for my colleagues in the municipal sector.
Right.
And I have, fortunately, a somewhat unique combination of education skills and experience.
If council as a whole had a change of heart, I'm not talking about Mr. Fitzpatrick or Mayor Kilger, but if council as a whole had a change of heart, would you consider coming back and working for the City of Cornwall if you were requested at this point?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that would obviously be a fairly difficult conversation to have, and there'd have to be there'd have to be full disclosure, because as a consequence of what's happened, you could say that I have very severe trust issues right now. So for me to come back to the City of Cornwall, I wouldn't rule that out. I'd be happy to do that if you know, the whole trust question could be adequately addressed. I like it here. I thought I would retire here. I loved all the people I worked with. It was great.
You know, aside from the settlement, which was pre-negotiated into your contract, and you know, as large as it is for someone that's earning the average salary of Cornwall, which is under $30,000 a year, it's basically 2 years of pay. Have you been wronged?
Again, I can only answer that subjectively. Mm-hmm. I would say, of course, I've been wronged in one sense. In another sense, a strictly legal sense, and people have asked me about this, they've said, Rob, why don't you do something about this? You know, people have come up to me in the street, and I say, the city has a legal right to be wrong. Mm-hmm. People who are employed in a non-union capacity work at the pleasure of their employers. Their employer's legal obligation is not to guarantee them a job for life, but simply to provide them with appropriate notice of the termination of their employment or pay in lieu of that notice in circumstances where they cannot make out a case for the just cause dismissal or the for cause dismissal of an employee.
Do you think there's a public perception that somehow you've been attributed being responsible for the Shea and the Pilon cases?
From what I've read in the media, that seems to be the belief.
Do you think that that's an accurate portrayal?
Absolutely not. If it was, if you take what's been printed in the media at face value, and I was responsible for the outcomes in those two cases, and my responsibility stemmed from things that I had done that fell below a reasonable standard of performance that could be expected of me, that would have given the city a strong case for cause, and then they wouldn't have to honor the severance provision in my contract.
It's a valid point.